Okay, hello there, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, so someone else is coming in. Okay, so we'll get going here. Some more people signing in. So for today, we don't have too much to talk about. I'm just going to kind of give you another little kind of lecture on how to make the focal point stand out, called framing the focal point, just another way for you guys to think about it. And when talking about that, we will include, we'll start by talking about negative space as something very good to consciously think about in your artwork. Okay, did everyone see, or by chance, did you guys see the email I sent out kind of this morning-ish? Basically, I just showed you guys, there's a new drawing challenge up here called Value Contrast Drawing Challenge. That will be due next week. So I really just want you guys to practice how to use value contrast, use the lightest values and darkest values on your focal point, and use kind of medium values throughout the rest of the composition. So basically, I want you to recreate this drawing, do your own version of this using just line, and then fill it in with different shades of gray. So using up all these values down here, the little mini value scale, and then keeping the most value contrast right there on the Space Needle. So this will just be kind of like one last check-in before the project to make sure you guys understand value contrast, like really just doing these drawing challenges. If we were in the classroom, I would just spend a portion of the class time having you guys draw in class, and I could like walk around and actually see your drawings and see how you're working and give you suggestions in real time. Since we're not able to do that, that's what these drawing challenges are for, just to kind of reinforce the lectures and just make sure so I can see your guys' work as you are starting. Here, Rebecca turned hers in already, which looks like really good value contrast. You have solid black here on the top of the Space Needle, a good thick outline, and then against the bright white moon shape there as well. And this one is also a very big focal point, which is cool, but you have solid black against solid white right there in the center where we should be looking. So yeah, you guys can always kind of look at what other students did for ideas. Don't copy them exactly, but it should give you kind of an idea of how to complete the drawing challenges. Okay, I think that's any sort of updates. Other than that, just make sure you're practicing along with the pen tool file. So here it is, pentool.zip. That has kind of the worksheets in there. And so next week is kind of just going to be critique week. I think we'll only meet on Monday. But then after that, I just want you guys to work on your thumbnails for project 2 as we move forward to completing that project. But I'll check in with you guys on Monday and kind of we'll see how everything's going. Any questions on the drawing challenge or anything like that before we get on to our topic today? Okay. So this is what we will be talking about today: how to use negative space in your artwork, and also how to frame the focal point, framing the focal point. So let's start talking about negative space. I think I've probably mentioned it in this class. We'll go over it in more detail here. Negative space within your composition is basically empty space. In graphic design, same idea. Lots of times it's called white space. So you want to be conscious of where you leave negative space in a composition. And what it does to a composition when you eliminate the negative space. So let's just do a drawing with our little house example we've used before. So as I'm doing this here, I'm thinking about filling up the negative space. I don't want to leave, I'm trying intentionally to not leave any empty space here in this composition. So as you look at this, and I'm working on it, there's not a lot of empty space here. So what does this kind of do to the drawing when there is no empty space in the drawing? What kind of feeling or reaction do you have to this when you see this drawing?
It makes it so busy, you don't really know where to look.
Exactly, yeah. Busy is the main kind of culprit. So it makes you feel busy. And you also said you don't always know where to look. So it's harder to make that focal point stand out if you have too much, if you don't have enough negative space. So busy will kind of feel, you know, make you feel claustrophobic. Your eyes just kind of constantly dart around the composition because you don't know where to look. It's not as organized. Sometimes you want to have that busy feel, like if I, you know, wanted the story to match that feeling. But I can draw this house in a way that has lots of negative space as well. So I'm going to do the same thing, a few trees, a few bushes, some clouds. So now, what's the difference about this one down here? Number one, what does that one make you feel that's different than number two?
Well, there's less to look at, so your eye naturally goes to the what's actually there first, like the house there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, so because there's stuff here, you know, our vision's going to be drawn there towards the stuff. So this is kind of an extreme example here, but I just want to really illustrate that difference between negative space and positive space. So the negative space here is all of the sky. So it's not filled up with anything. It's completely empty. So you need to consciously think about where you want to have negative space in your drawing. One isn't necessarily better or worse than the other, but one definitely has a different effect on the viewer. Okay, so I could, you know, put values on here to make sure that this stands out as the focal point. And even though you can still see the focal point, it still creates, yeah, that busy feeling where this has, your eye can rest in this area. Letting the eye rest is very important. It will usually have a calmer feel to it. So most of the times when students and artists who are learning are starting out, they have a tendency to fill up that frame, to fill up a composition. So I oftentimes will recommend for people to really try to utilize negative space because it's going against our natural tendencies. Just like our natural tendency is kind of for a symmetrical composition, so we have to kind of force almost the rule of thirds. So our tendency is to fill stuff up, but sometimes we want to think about how to leave stuff empty. as well. And you can kind of do something in the middle. These are like two extreme examples. And oftentimes it is a little more balanced than this, where it's not quite an extreme, just one or the other. So this one here is closer to being divided by half and half. Half positive space, half negative space. And again, not one better than the other, but good to see what works best. So this is a good thing to do to play with in your thumbnails when you're working on your thumbnails for the next project. Try some compositions that have a large negative space, try some that have really small negative space, and try some that's kind of an equal divide between the both. That can be a really good way just to get some variety into your thumbnails, because that is something I do want to see, is variety in your thumbnails. I don't want all your thumbnails to look exactly the same. I want you to be exploring different compositions, rule of thirds, symmetrical, big focal point, small focal point, large negative space, small negative space, things like that. Okay. So any questions on that negative space? How to possibly use it for some compositions? Okay. So sometimes you will want that busy feel, so just note that that is what will happen. Okay, framing the focal point is literally having a focal point. So here's our composition. Here's our focal point. It's literally just putting a frame around that focal point. Just doing something that simple will kind of draw our eyes to it. We know that that rectangular shape is important, especially when it's repeated after the frame of the composition is repeated with the frame of framing the focal point. So even if I have multiple shapes down here, now this one with the frame around it, dark value, is going to stand out as the focal point. Okay, so we got some weird looking people here. And again, to just make one of these characters a focal point, all we got to do is put a frame around it. But what helps, what the frame is nice for, which I've seen in some people's artwork already, is it lends itself well for creating value contrast. So I can then put like a 50% gray over everything else except the frame. So now it just is a kind of a natural way to create that value contrast. It's basically the same thing I did with the moon with that bat flying through the sky demo, where the moon is the frame around the character there. So you'll see lots of things used to frame the focal point. You'll see moon, doors / windows, clouds are used a lot. And then also negative space, which we'll talk about in a sec. So you might have a drawing of a person here. And then let's say they're on like a sea edge or a cliff there. You can put just a little cloud there as their background. And then again, this will lend itself for value contrast. So it's just kind of a nice way when you're adding that value, if you have a frame behind the character or your focal point, whatever it may be, you can be like, oh, I will leave that frame, whether it's clouds, moon, or any other shape, I will leave that frame blank white, then make my focal point dark, and then you have a natural way to create value contrast there. Okay, any questions on that? Okay. Okay, so let's look at frame in a frame with doors and windows. You guys have probably seen this. Character walks into a room. Make it a horror movie. You may have other stuff around here, you know, bookshelves, other windows, ceiling, light fixtures hanging down. But having this frame right here allows me to frame that focal point as the character. I'll make the character / focal point solid black, and then drop a medium value over everything else. You guys probably seen a shot similar to this possibly in movies or something like that. I'm just reusing what a bunch of other people have done before to use as an example. So that's kind of frame in the frame. You could do the same thing with a window or any kind of rectangular shape you want to create in your composition. It is pretty straightforward. Usually you put it behind the character, and it's just, it's going to draw our eye, and it lends itself to creating that good value contrast. Okay, put your focal point in negative space. Now, this is not a rule that you always have to do, but it is a good suggestion and probably something you should try out when working on thumbnails or a project. Let's create a very busy area. So we said, that lack of negative space makes it busy. So I want to create one sort of kind of busy section in this composition. So a lot of buildings here. And some smoke coming up. Okay. So if I wanted a little plane here to be my focal point, especially if it's small, I'm not going to put it, obviously not right here. That's going to be really hard to see. Or like here, overlapping that, the smoke coming up. As I pull away from that, you can hardly even see that shape of the plane. But if I take it and put it right here, then it's really going to stand out nicely. So we got that there, and just putting it in its negative space make it really stand out super clearly to the viewer. Sometimes you have to be creative. So let's say you have like a scene in a jungle, which is a very busy, sort of environment. There's a lot going on. And let's say we want to do like Tarzan here swinging through the vines. Again, there's no negative space in this drawing. So it's going to be hard. We're going to lose the character in there. A little bit there, but even so. So in order to make your focal point stand out, you have to design that composition in a way that makes sense and that makes your focal point stand out. Like it could be a really cool idea. These could be like really well drawn trees, a really great drawn person swinging. But if you can't see the focal point and it's getting lost there, and you need to like rethink about how you are designing the scene. So you might have to, reimagine it. So maybe you think about, you come to like the edge of the forest here, or just like kind of a break in the trees. And now we have a much more logical space to put the focal point character. And then again, negative space will lend itself to value contrast. I can come and put medium value over all the trees. And then that makes the negative space a light value behind a dark value of the character. And that just kind of, as you look at it here, creates a frame just like that with the negative space. You know, I could push it, you know, even further. We could put like a moon shape back here. That's not totally necessary, but it's just another idea if you want to push it a little bit further. So always a good idea to try and put that negative or that focal point in the negative space. That's not always going to be a solution, but oftentimes that is a good way to make that focal point stand out. And if you kind of think that way, it will force you to create a composition that has negative space in it as you're working. So again, just always be conscious of how much negative space you are creating, because that negative space is useful both to kind of get at the emotional feeling of the image. So you want to create something calm or something busy. But then that negative space has a practical use as well for putting that focal point in the negative space. And just thinking about putting a frame in a frame or a shape around or behind your focal point, which will make it stand out more and help you create some value contrast. So just more things to think about as you're working on the your thumbnails, as you're working on the drawing challenges, things like that. Hopefully this will just give you some more tools to work with to create those good compositions with clear focal points. Any questions on that? All right, well, I'm just gonna show you guys some masterworks before we get out of here, so you can kind of see how other artists have framed the focal point. I just came across this image yesterday. So looking at this image here, what is the focal point of this image?
Well, the man in the middle, right?
Uh-huh. And what specifically, what part of him?
Well, I guess the book in the stand he's interacting with.
Yeah, the stand. I guess it's the stand and the book. I don't think there's a man, right? I just really focusing on his hand.
You're focusing on his hand. Okay, cool.
It is kind of at the middle.
So yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So the hands are oftentimes the focal point, but also look at how they're framing his head up here.
Yeah, and then the face so white.
Exactly. So when there's people in a composition, if you see their whole figure, normally the face and the hands become the focal point. So the artist will oftentimes look for ways to make the hands and the face stand out, because that's what we perceive with the action and emotion of a character. So what are they doing? They're interacting with something with their hands, and they probably have a facial expression. So yeah, so our eyes are being drawn here to the hands. This is just kind of a big rectangle shape here. This hand has value contrast, light hand against dark background. And then also the face. So we have we got a light window, dark hat and dark beard, and then a light face. So that's kind of drawing our attention here in this one. So it kind of creates a nice little triangle composition, which is good. But I just like this little subtle frame thrown right there behind the head to really make sure our eye is drawn up there to the head. So again, it's good to look at art like this, art that you really like, and be like, what is the focal point? How is the artist making the focal point stand out? Are they using value contrast? Are they using frames? Are they using leading lines? Usually it will be all of the above. This is the artist Frank Frazetta here. Has anyone heard of Frazetta? So you have the woman here as the focal point. And then the frame and the focal point. So they got the frame in this dense jungle here. And then the moon as well is kind of doing the secondary frame. So creating negative space. And having a clear focal point on there with the focal point in the negative space. And then using leading lines as well. But if you ever want to look up really cool fantasy, early fantasy art, Frank Frazetta is really good. He's one of my favorite artists. This is Pascal Campion. I might have shown you some of his art before. If not, I'll probably show you some later on. So really simple composition here, family playing on a hillside, but then just the frame of the sunshine around those focal point shapes of the silhouettes of the family there. So our eye is drawn down here. We got leading lines of these sun rays kind of leading us over there. And just a ton of value contrast created with the frame of that sun. So there's really no mistaking where to look in this composition here. So especially if you have a very, oh, this is kind of a small image. Especially if you have a really small focal point. So look how small this focal point is here. Tiny little fox. That's really, really small in that composition. But then they framed it in this little bit of light coming through the trees there. So that obviously will create value contrast because that's light. Then you have the nice dark shadow here underneath the guy. We don't talk about color in this class, but that bright red is going to stand out in green as well. If you guys ever get into taking a color theory class down the road. But especially with really, really small focal points, you really want to be careful to make sure it really stands out. Value contrast, framing, leading lines, things like that. So big clear focal point, the face of the character, putting it in negative space. So the sky is the negative space, and then just using this shape up here is basically the frame in which to frame that character. So not a lot of negative space in this one, probably about, a third of the composition is negative space. So just put this big creature character up there in the negative space. This one's pretty fun. So you got a big, exciting focal point here. All these characters. But then to create a frame, we do see a doorway back here. It's kind of subtle, but that will get the point across there. All right, so any questions about framing the focal point or negative space? Okay, so that is going to be it for today.